finally did it. I made my car objectively worse. The way I went about doing this was buying myself an exact copy of the Mazda Speed muffler that came with my car. Now I really like the way this thing sounds, and frankly, I just want this thing to be a little louder when I'm out in the middle of nowhere and I can afford to be an obnoxious douche. So here's a picture of the overall schematic I'm going to be using. The overall build is pretty simple. I'm going to have to weld on a stainless steel elbow. Using a couple of V-band clamps, I'll put in a butterfly valve. The butterfly valve will be moved by vacuum pressure supplied through a vacuum line. Engine vacuum or atmospheric pressure will be supplied through the vacuum line to the actuator. By closing a switch on the center console, engine vacuum will be directed through the vacuum line to the actuator, opening up the butterfly valve and making my car nice and obnoxious. Cutting off the heat shielding was pretty straightforward. At some point I'll definitely heat wrap the exhaust because the RX-7 is already known for getting pretty hot on the inside, and having no insulation on the outside is definitely not doing it any favors. So here you see me using the ancient technique of eyeballing it. For my purposes, this should be good enough. I'm not good enough of a welder for it to make a difference anyway. In essence, I need to get the section of pipe I'm welding on to be in line with that section of pipe you see leading up to the muffler itself. This will allow it to slot nicely behind the rear subframe, but in front of the fuel tank with a decent amount of space on either end. For an eyeball cut, I'm not sad about this. So what followed this was a pretty frustrating experience. I mean, I guess that's to be expected. It was my second time trying to TIG weld. Anyways, my mask wasn't working and the thing wouldn't start to arc. It was a pain in the ass. Anyway, the overall process was pretty ugly, and honestly, it's best you don't see this. I bought myself a spare set of console switches off the internet. These things are a translucent white plastic with paint put over them. If you scrape off the old paint, you can stencil in whatever new logo you want. So if you search exhaust button on the internet, what you usually come across are these pictures of these Porsche buttons. These look pretty cool, but they don't really match the style of my car since it was made in the 90s. Based on this, I came up with a fairly abstract design which I felt matched the character of the car. It's not really obvious what the thing means. It's supposed to be an exhaust tip with some sound coming out of it. One of my friends said it looked like a tuning fork with some Wi-Fi bands coming out. But what does he know? Here you see the tape stencil. Not bad. The first thing I tried out was a simple rattle can with black paint. I realized immediately that this was a bad idea. The paint went on too thick and wet, and I was worried it was going to dissolve the adhesive on the tape. I got a small bottle of black touch-up paint, thinned it with some lacquer thinner, and used an airbrush. This was definitely the way to go. I wish I'd gone a little thinner on the paint because the droplets are still kind of coarse and you can see it on the final finish, but overall I'm pretty happy with the result. After this, it was a simple process of scraping off the stencil, and look at that. Not bad. As far as wiring, I want the light bulb inside the switch to illuminate along with the rest of the switches on the console. The switch has 4 wires leading into it. The 2 thinner ones go to the light bulb. So if you go into the electrical schematics for the RX-7, you'll find this first page. Yeesh. Since most of you probably don't speak Japanese, take my word for it when I say this little red box here says illumination. That sounds like a good place to look for interior lights. Sure enough, you see that most of the small lights on the center console are driven off this circuit here. My plan is to use a couple of vampire clips to hook onto the wires going to the fog light switch light bulb. That's allowing me to power the light bulb in my switch in parallel with all the other light bulbs. Alright, I've got my lights wired up. Now just to turn on the interior lights. Well, as it turns out, I just didn't squeeze down the vampire clips enough, so here we go. And just like that, after a lot of welding and even more grinding, my muffler's done. There's the original on the right, since if you can't be good, you can at least be redundant. So here's everything installed in the car. I've got the solenoid valve screwed down to one of the grounding posts. One of the 2 wires is also attached to that same grounding post. The solenoid valve itself doesn't have polarity, so either way you apply voltage to it, it'll work. You can see the check valve, which makes sure that only negative pressure is applied to the actuator. The red wire leads off to the switch on the inside of the car. The vacuum line with the bend in it goes down to the back end of the car. I kept it under the same plastic cover that houses the fuel and brake lines, so it should be protected from the elements. The vacuum supply line is brought up along the firewall and then tees into a spare connection on the intake manifold. This wire into the shift boot is the same one we saw leading down under the car. It's definitely not the most elegant solution. I'm going to be looking for a better way to route this through. But it's all safe, functional, and it's out of sight. That small fuse box you saw in the previous shot, it's all being fed off of the same piggyback fuse that I have in the fuse box under the right kick panel. I have it connected in this slot for the 15 amp meter, which is in the column second from the right and in the middle. The reason I chose this was just because if you look in the electrical diagram, this fuse receives power when the key is both in the ignition and cranking position, or ignition 1 and ignition 2, which is the only time I want these accessories to have power available to them. Now time for a test. As you can see, there's a little bit of gas leaking out. As I understand, this is normal for these valves, and it shouldn't be a problem. Here you can see how the exhaust pipe fits in between the rear subframe and the gas tank of the car. There's a good 3/4 inch air gap between the protective shield in front of the gas tank and the exhaust pipe itself. To be safe, I will eventually heat wrap this. I'm also glad the exhaust pipe doesn't hang out below the car. Honestly, when I see videos of people installing these things and it's by far the lowest point of the whole car, I assume these people weren't vaccinated. So don't be like them. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Comment below, let me know what you think.